I guess now for something completely different. So I'm a retired scientist, but I haven't retired my mind, and I continue to write books and papers on an understanding of how our own physiology actually informs us about the kinds of things that we just talked about. But I prefer to do the testable and refutable Popperian kind of science that allows us to have reproducibility of observation and experience. But I might add that I have had an out-of-body experience, so I do believe that it exists, but I think it's from internally from our endocrine system. So I'm an endocrinologist by training. Okay, so how do I advance these slides? Okay, there we go. And I'm sorry, I have to get rid of that view. Oops, let's see. Sorry. So there's a lot of stuff in front of my verbiage here. Let's see. Oh, okay. So understanding consciousness is the most important thing we need to know, and it's referred to as the explanatory gap. Where is consciousness? Evolution of physiology has been traced back to the unicell using cell-cell communication. That's my work. Initially, this book of evolutionary biology, cell-cell communication, and complex disease. I use the symbiogenesis principle that Lynn Margulis had fostered many years ago, and it basically states that when we've met with existential threats as a species, we've assimilated those factors from the environment in order to use them for our own benefit as physiology. So consequently, physiology operates based on the same laws of nature as the cosmos. Consciousness is our awareness of the cosmologic laws of nature. It is why we feel that there is something greater than ourselves, for example. Okay. So in the beginning, the Earth was covered by water, and lipids generated. Lipids are very common in space. They're generated by pulsars, for example. And so when you mix oil and water like that, you get this phenomenon of the lipids aligning at the air-liquid interface. And under the influence of gravity, these lipids will align and pack at the surface, and they'll form what's called a micelle. And that micelle is the origin of cells. And it provides a protected space in which Schrodinger's negentropy, as he described in his What is Life book in 1944, negative entropy, chemiosmosis, are able to exist in that protected space. And homeostasis is the guiding force that maintains that structure and function. But this transition from individual lipids to micelles is actually a quantum leap. So this is where the quantum mechanical principle emerges from. More deeply, I'm superimposing this idea that quantum entanglement, the QE thing here, that actually is the reference to the quantum realm, and it interrelates with the negentropy and chemiosmosis and homeostasis through symbiogenesis as the way in which physiology has evolved, because both symbiogenesis and quantum entanglement serve the purpose of maintaining homeostasis. So the reason I'm confident of this relationship is because, having done a critical experiment about 20 years ago now, putting differentiated cells under microgravitational conditions, 0G shown on the far left, those cells lose their phenotype, they lose their identity, they lose their ego, they lose their evolutionary history. So clearly there's an interrelationship between gravity and the evolutionary principle. And that in turn gives rise, if you look at the far right, that's the basis for evolution, in my opinion. Darwin was looking at an epiphenomenon, the cellular self-selection process, the auto-engineering, the autopoiesis that Maturana and Valera described is actually what the underlying principle of evolution is. So on the far left, I'm showing contrasting phylogeny and ontogeny, which are basically the same process at two different timescales. And they in turn are dictated by Einsteinian relativity, showing here E equals mc squared. The energy process is actually behind all of physiologic evolution. And I'm regressing the process of alveolar formation in the lung, which I know well because that's my bread and butter for 50 years. And I'm regressing that against time on this Cartesian coordinate. And what I'm showing here is that evolution is a carrying on of the energy flow, which actually originates in the Big Bang, in my opinion. So that's the vector that was referred to earlier. So that's kind of the grand scheme of things. And the reason I feel I'm confident that this is correct is because if you look at the embryo, so the origin of this Cartesian coordinate is the Big Bang, if you will. And the progression of the energy is actually represents what happens during embryology, because each successive step from a zygote to a morula to a gastrula, et cetera, until you have the offspring, those are each high energy phosphate exchanges. So basically the cell has the ability to take a signal from another cell and convert it into high energy phosphate like cyclic AMP or inositol phosphates, and that in turn triggers either growth or differentiation of the organism. So it's all about energy flows, just as Whitehead had taught us. So the cell is the measure of all things, is what I'm trying to communicate here, as contrasted with the Greek aphorism of man is the measure of all things. But now we know enough cell biology to be able to understand that property. So the cell is a topology partitioning the explicate and implicate orders, that's David Bohn's wholeness in the implicate order, literally forming the interface between the outside and inside of the cell. Therefore, math and physics are superseded by biology, in my opinion. Unlike Rutherford's, all science is either physics or stamp collecting. And furthermore, Husserl, the philosopher, in his paper, The Origin of Geometry, published in 1936, says unequivocally, the geometry isn't within us, it's external to us. We internalize it, we mess around with it in our heads, and then we make triangles and circles, et cetera, et cetera. So mathematics is external to us, as opposed to what I'm talking about. So here's a mapping of the symbiogenic process. I'm starting from the non-local properties here in the cosmos and the gravitational effect. And then there's the local effect of gravity on the organism, mediated initially by quantum entanglement and then by symbiogenesis. And then as you look at the top row of X's, Y's, and Z's, that's representative of how symbiogenesis actually accumulates knowledge from the environment and generates the organism. Because these factors are being compartmentalized, and ultimately we recognize them as our physiology. So it's taking the sort of the grand cosmologic view. So if you start with the Big Bang at the far left, it generated all the matter and energy in the cosmos as we recognize it. But there was a singularity that existed prior to that, at least that's the theory. And then you have this vector generated by the Big Bang. You have a 0 point, and then as I showed in the previous slide, you have this interrelationship between the organism and its environment. The cosmos is ever expanding, as is our environment ever changing. And so we are missioned with being able to remain at equipoise with that vector, and that is evolution. So another way to look at this is as a lattice work. So stellar evolution is the generation of light by stars, and those stars generate the first 36 elements in the order of their atomic mass, from hydrogen to iron. But interestingly, for example, in the evolution of the thyroid gland from the endostyle in invertebrates, that organism remembers that process because iodine is element 53. So there's this gap between the 36th element, iron, and the 53rd element, iodine. But the memory and the history of the organism is embedded in it. And so it remembers all this process, and that's why it's able to implement iodine and in the evolution of the thyroid gland, for example. In parallel with that, it's thought by some that gravity also mediated the formation of planets. So now you have the biology and the planetary formation under the aegis of the same gravitational force. And so I'm showing the symbiogenic process at the top, X, XY, XYZ, for example, and then that's generating physiology, as I'm showing in the stippled circle, which is the cell. And as I said, the planetary formation and the evolution of biology are homologs of one another, in the homolog in the sense that they both come from the same origin. And if you think of Gaia, Lovelock's theory of a living Earth, that's really what he was talking about. And so I'm just saying here at the bottom that local consciousness it is both is the binary aspect of our consciousness, but that gives rise to the analog form of our physiology, which is actually what connects us to the cosmic consciousness through this relationship between gravity and the evolving organism. So sorry, this is a mess here. Oh. So evolution is non-commutative. That is to say, it's irreversible. And because evolution is a function of cell-cell communication, it is inefficient to add a newly evolved trait in the middle or at the beginning of a series of evolved traits. So therefore, newly acquired traits are added at the end of a series of traits, or what is described in biology as terminal addition. So I'm trying to explain why the puzzle pieces fit together the way they do and the way we see them. But there's an underlying set of mechanisms that are physically consistent with, ultimately, with quantum mechanics. So the form of evolution, so if evolution is based upon Darwinian random evolution, I couldn't have discovered these relationships. Materna and Varela described it as autopoiesis, or self-organizing and self-referential, but they never explained how and why that occurred, even though Varela was a schooled biologist. So it's determined. So evolution is determined by context and environment, striving to reestablish homeostasis. So homeostasis is the guiding principle for maintaining equipoise. And if evolution were random, as I said earlier, I'm sorry, some of my verbiage is covered up by stuff. Then I could not have been able to trace the evolution of physiologic traits like lungs and kidneys and brains and bones all the way back to the unicellular state. I would have come up with blind alleys. So that's why functionally and analytically, I think I'm on the right track here. Okay. So as I was explaining, so, let's see. So a phase transition from lipids to micelles is a quantum change, and I described that micelle formation in an earlier slide. Zero gravity causes cells to lose their phenotypic identity in vitro and in vivo. I showed that in a 2003 paper. It was reproduced in 2006. In 2016, and it was in a study in reported in 2006. A group at Boston University showed that the same phenomenon of loss of phenotype occurs in yeast. So it occurs across the entire gamut of eukaryotes. Loss of cell-cell signaling during aging and senescence is a loss of physiologic identity. So the process of aging and senescence is actually recapitulating the gain during development and then the loss of these cellular communication properties. So it's a different way of understanding why we age. For example, Mazur reported that patients recovering from general anesthesia experience a recapitulation of brain phylogeny. So here again, we have this recrudescence of the process of evolution, but it's internal to our physiology. Kubler-Ross is well known for her description of near-death experiences and seeing a point of light. And I'm wondering whether the transition from the to the non-local is what she was describing, or what the patient is experiencing, seeing the cosmic light, if you will. Ultimate return to the singularity that existed prior to the Big Bang. Is it possible that that's what we're doing? Is we're trying to maintain our relationship with that singularity that existed before the Big Bang. So the body can remember trauma, for example. We know that. And the answer, and maybe this way of thinking about evolution and physiology is the answer to Chalmers' hard question. That is, seeing red when we're injured, and that being innate. And the body memory is evidence that the cell can remember. Receptor gene duplications occurred during the water-land transition, and they changed the physiology of the lung, for example. So there are 3 gene receptors that that duplicated or amplified during the water-to-land transition 500 million years ago, parathyroid hormone-related protein receptor, the beta-adrenergic receptor, and the glucocorticoid receptor. And in each case, if you delete those genes, you get fundamental failure of the development of the lung, the kidney, the heart, each organ that was evolved in order to adapt to land. Furthermore, I've published a paper laying claim to the idea that the cell membrane is actually a Mobius strip. And mathematicians in Israel have similarly said that they have a mathematics that explains the Mobius strip phenomenon in their hands mathematically. So we're collaborating to try and understand this relationship. But briefly, this is fairly complicated. What they've done is they call this the soft Mobius map, and you have a family of both real numbers and complex numbers being merged together. And when you take those values and they generate a Mobius strip, which has neither an inside or an outside. And that's exactly the same thing I'm talking about with regard to cell biology. You have the cell generating, having a cell membrane, which is the real numbers set and binary selection and digital consciousness. And then you have the formation of physiology, which is analog, and that's our physiologic consciousness. So here again, I'm showing the relationship between symbiogenesis, quantum entanglement, and cosmologic gravity as the non-local manifestation of our relationship with the cosmos. So I wanted to explain that the Mobius strip designation is not literal, it's figurative, due to the permeability of the membrane, creating no inside or outside. So here I'm showing how gravity impinges on the quantum entanglement process locally, and then if gravity is removed from the cell, or if the cell is removed from the gravitational effect, it defaults to the cosmologic gravitational relationship because of the non-local characteristic of quantum entanglement. And here I'm contrasting the quantum entanglement again of the gravitational effect locally derived from the cosmic gravitational effect, which is non-local, giving rise to the physiologic evolution process as mediated by cell-cell communication. And so that actually potentially explains things like near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, meditation, runner's high, and even the process of death, because there's this loss of the integrity of the cell, the identity of the cell, due to loss of relationship with the gravitational principle. So I'm sorry, I have to read. So evolution has formed physiology, starting with the accumulation of factors in the environment that posed existential threats, followed by their compartmentation and linkage via cell-cell communication mediated by soluble growth factors and their receptors. This way of thinking about consciousness is consistent with the idea that consciousness is the mapping of our physiology onto our history, acting as the memory for our evolution. And I've published numerous papers based upon this concept and books as well. The above are consistent with the descriptions of consciousness and subconsciousness. It is also consistent with the Libet experiment, showing that there's a 300 millisecond lag between the response of the brain to a stimulus, electrical stimulus, and the physical response, as if consciousness were initiated within us first, action coming after the fact. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Do we have any questions? We've got plenty of time for questions. If anybody wants to dive into it. I think there were some, if you want to scroll back in chat, I think Sky had quite a few comments while you were going on. So that could be some stuff to address.
Okay.
And Stephanie just asked a question. So take a look at chat and you've got a few minutes. Yeah. So see what you want to dig into. Also, 2V has his hand up. If you'd like to take a voice question, it's all up to you.
Sure. Let me take a voice question while I try and.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. It was very, very interesting. I just want to ask you one question. I think in all the evolution theory, And also, I don't think that I think in your theory, something is missing, which is a will or intention. Because I believe that without will or intention of some consciousness, there was no evolutions. Because every animal want to live, they want to continue to produce, etc., which is essential. And this is not just an animal, it's also every cell want to eat and to survive, etc. And this is one of the difference between something living and something not living. So first of all, the question to you, do you think that intention or will to evolve and to live is something fundamental, which for me, I believe is missing in order to create evolutions? And can you explain anything or touch anything about will or intention in any level, doesn't matter if in the cell himself or in the cosmos or the consciousness? Thank you.
So thank you for the question, Tubi. Yeah, so Spinoza talked about conatus, the
You are sorry, you are mute.
Sorry. So Spinoza called it conatus, the drive. What I really need to say is that what's missing from the literature is that it's not observer or observed. The symbiogenesis principle generates both the observer and the observed, both in the same entity. That's where all of the drive for maintaining the equipoise comes from. So I fully agree with you. There is that drive. And I am of the opinion that that is because the cell, the unicell, actually is a manifestation, is a replication, a simulacrum of the singularity. And so in that sense, just as the singularity strives to maintain itself, so does the cell. I am of the opinion that we are homo creatans. I think we are here to recreate, for example, the fusion reaction, to recapitulate the sun because it's going to burn out. So that's our responsibility. I think that's where the drive comes from. Maybe Sky could articulate. I don't know where to start here. So maybe Sky could articulate what he or she is asking.
Hi, yeah, this is me. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, well, most of them were comments because my cosmology is very different from mainstream cosmology. So of course I had a lot of disagreements there. For instance, my research shows that the universe is 42 trillion years old, and all the dark matter is just burned out stars and stuff. So it's not really a question, but I had a bit of difficulty following your connection between cosmology and biology. I don't know if you could restate that connection.
Sure. So I basically used the Bayesian approach to reverse engineer a physiologic evolution. And each time I went through that process with what we know about the development and phylogeny of any given physiologic trait, lungs, kidneys, bone, whatever, you always end up in the unicellular state. So it's a symbiogenic process, and symbiogenesis basically services the maintenance of homeostasis, even under the threat of demise. So it's existential. And then when I thought about, well, where would that have emerged from? I thought, well, maybe that it came from the quantum entanglement, which does the same thing. Its property of local and non-local is to maintain the homeostatic set point, if you will, of photons or electrons, or something at that particulate level. So that's, so that's where the physiology meets the physics. And my experiment with microgravity, zero gravity, speaks to that, because the zero gravity effect is actually affecting the cell at the quantum level, in my opinion.
But are you saying that gravity is connected to biology or something?
Absolutely. The molecule I mentioned, so I was funded for 30 years to study parathyroid hormone-related protein. It's a stretch-regulated gene. So in the bone, when you release the tension on the bone, as in astronauts who develop osteoporosis, that's why, because they don't generate the PTHRP to maintain calcium homeostasis. Or the lung will not form in a mouse that doesn't have that gene, or a glomeruli, and it goes on and on and on. So absolutely, there is an intimate relationship between gravity and, I'm of the opinion that gravity initiated the life form. Yes.
Okay, but I think you need quantum mechanics to allow non-computational things to happen so that you can have life, because life is highly non-computational. Would you agree with that?
Can you define non-computational?
Penrose has pointed out that if you biological evolution, if you had random mutations of computer programs, basically the computer program would just become useless, and it's the same with biological things. If you just assume random mutations guided by nothing, it wouldn't work, and that's why many religious people, they point out that you can't just have random mutations to explain biology. It's all too hard to explain. Yeah.
I agree.
And basically, in parapsychology, people explain everything with the non-local realm. Everything that we experience is there as a record, like in Indian philosophy, the Akashic records. But it should only include the past, because we experience the past, not the future. As to the future, probably there are just potential futures, or maybe parts of the future which are computational, like the trajectory of asteroids and stuff like that. And biological evolution, in my opinion, is based on memories from past iterations of the universe, like past lives of the universe, if you will.
I agree with that. Yes, but I'm of the opinion that we exist in both the past, present, and future simultaneously. We misconstrue. I think that we go from unicell to unicell, not from adult to adult. And in fact, the zygote represents the singularity of life, and so it then goes through the iterations. So, for example, people talk about biology being complicated or complex. It's not. It's very simple, actually. All the complications, all the bells and whistles of limbs and brains and heads and organs, whatever. That's actually our history, and we require that phenotypic history in order to wend our way through the environment to detect novel change in order to adapt. That's epigenetic research. That's what my laboratory is funded to do at UCLA. So that's why I think that, so we've gotten everything backwards. As I'm of the opinion that, for example, just like the Enlightenment was given rise to by the realization that the sun is the center of the solar system, similarly, we are not the center of the biosphere. We have to get over ourselves. This has to happen in order for us to survive, or we'll become extinct and the roaches will take over. But yeah.
Well, on that, I think that have you heard of the CMB anomalies, cosmic microwave background anomalies? They basically are centered around Earth. They're correlated with the equinox and the ecliptic of Earth, and in my opinion, that indicates that all wave functions in the universe collapse here on Earth, which would actually mean that, not in a gravitational sense, but in a quantum mechanical sense, we are an island of entanglement, and that island is basically is centered around Earth. That's my opinion. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of how I stumbled onto this idea of the quantum realm, because if you reduce on development and phylogeny to cellular communication to create a common denominator, the endocrine principle actually causes a wave collapse. So that's how you enter the quantum realm, and I've experienced that.
So your wave collapse is on the cellular level, in your theory.
Yes.
Okay. In my theory, it's basically two projections onto the neocortex. One projection, and that's why the time lag in Liebert's experiments.
Okay, guys, I've got to cut us off here, but thank you I felt like I was sitting in a scientific meeting hall, listening to the debate go back and forth between a microphone speaker and a platform speaker. So that was really great.